I have spent considerable time observing the peculiar relationship between the human soul and material wealth, and I must confess that few subjects reveal more clearly the intricate workings of our fallen nature than our attitudes toward money. How often I have witnessed the most sincere believers, those who would readily discuss the deepest mysteries of faith, suddenly become tongue-tied and uncomfortable when the conversation turns to finances. There is something profoundly troubling about this self-consciousness that grips us when we consider our material needs and desires, as if acknowledging our financial aspirations somehow diminishes our spiritual standing before God. Yet I would argue that this very discomfort, this shame we feel about money, may be one of the greatest obstacles to both our spiritual growth and our material prosperity. The enemy of our souls understands perfectly well that if he can make us ashamed of our legitimate needs and God-given desires for provision, he can keep us trapped in a cycle of spiritual and financial poverty that serves neither the kingdom of heaven nor the practical necessities of earthly life. Consider for a moment the young professional who feels guilty for wanting to earn more, as if ambition itself were somehow unholy, or the devoted Christian parent who struggles with debt, but feels too ashamed to seek wisdom about money management, believing that such concerns are beneath the dignity of someone who claims to trust in divine providence. These are not isolated cases, but symptoms of a much deeper spiritual malady, a false dichotomy that has been planted in our minds between the sacred and the secular, between spiritual virtue and material wisdom. This unfortunate separation has created a generation of believers who are spiritually earnest, but financially ineffective, who pray earnestly for God's provision, while simultaneously rejecting the very tools and principles through which that provision might flow. I have come to understand that this self-consciousness about money is not merely a personal quirk or cultural conditioning, but rather a strategic deception designed to keep us from exercising the dominion and stewardship that God intended for His children. The truth I wish to share with you today will challenge everything you have been taught about the relationship between faith and finances, between spiritual maturity and material prosperity. I have discovered through both careful reasoning and deep spiritual reflection that our shame about money is not humility but pride in disguise, not spiritual sensitivity but spiritual blindness masquerading as virtue. When we refuse to engage thoughtfully and strategically with financial matters, when we remain willfully ignorant of the principles that govern wealth creation and preservation, we are not demonstrating trust in God, but rather a subtle form of rebellion against His design for human flourishing. The same God who created the laws of physics and mathematics also established the principles that govern economic exchange and wealth building, and to ignore these principles while claiming spiritual superiority is as foolish as jumping from a building while claiming that faith will suspend the law of gravity. I want you to understand that true financial freedom is not about accumulating money for its own sake, nor is it about achieving some arbitrary level of material comfort, but rather about removing the barriers that prevent us from fulfilling our God-given purpose and potential. When we are constantly worried about money, when we are trapped in cycles of debt and financial stress, when we are too proud or too ashamed to learn the practical skills necessary for financial stewardship, we are not free to serve God or others with the effectiveness that He desires. The widow's mite was precious precisely because it represented sacrificial giving from her poverty, but imagine how much more she could have contributed to God's work if she had possessed the knowledge and resources to create sustainable wealth while maintaining her generous heart. Take a moment now to think about your own relationship with money and wealth. Do you find yourself making excuses for your financial struggles, telling yourself that spiritual people should not be concerned with such worldly matters? Have you convinced yourself that poverty is somehow more virtuous than prosperity, that struggling financially is a mark of spiritual authenticity, rather than a failure to apply biblical principles of stewardship and wisdom? I invite you to pause and honestly examine these beliefs, because I suspect you will find, as I have found, that many of them are not rooted in scripture or sound reasoning, but in fear, pride and cultural conditioning that has little to do with genuine faith or practical wisdom. The first step toward financial freedom is not learning about investment strategies or debt reduction techniques, though these are certainly important, but rather examining and correcting the false beliefs that create self-consciousness and shame around money in the first place. We must understand that God is not glorified by our financial ignorance any more than He is glorified by our ignorance in any other area of life. The same intellectual honesty and careful study that we bring to understanding theology or literature, or any other subject must be applied to understanding money, economics and wealth building. This is not about becoming materialistic or greedy, but about becoming effective stewards of the resources that God has entrusted to us, including our minds, our time and our capacity to learn and grow in wisdom. I have observed that those who remain self-conscious about money often do so because they have never taken the time to develop a coherent philosophy of wealth that integrates their spiritual beliefs with practical financial principles. They stumble through life making random financial decisions based on emotion, social pressure, or vague spiritual platitudes rather than on clear thinking and biblical wisdom. This approach inevitably leads to frustration and failure, which in turn reinforces their belief that financial success is somehow incompatible with spiritual authenticity. But this is precisely backward thinking, for the God who commands us to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves surely expects us to apply that wisdom to every area of our lives, including our finances. Now I want to address directly those of you who recognize yourselves in what I have been describing, those who feel that uncomfortable stirring in your spirit when money is discussed, who perhaps feel guilty for even listening to these words, because some part of you believes that good Christians should not think too carefully about material prosperity. I want you to know that I have felt exactly what you are feeling, and I have come to understand that this feeling is not the voice of the Holy Spirit warning you away from worldly concerns, but rather the voice of fear and false teaching that has kept you trapped in financial mediocrity while convincing you that your struggle is somehow noble. There is nothing noble about failing to learn the skills necessary for effective stewardship, nothing virtuous about remaining ignorant of principles that could free you from financial stress and enable you to serve God and others more effectively. The transformation I am speaking of begins with a simple but profound shift in perspective, a recognition that money is not evil in itself, but rather a tool that can be used for good or ill depending on the character and wisdom of the person who wields it. Just as a sword in the hands of a righteous warrior can defend the innocent, while the same weapon in the hands of a villain can cause great harm, so money in the hands of a wise and godly person becomes an instrument of blessing and positive impact, while money in the hands of someone who lacks wisdom or moral grounding becomes a source of corruption and destruction. The key is not to avoid the sword, but to become the kind of person who can wield it responsibly and effectively. This brings me to a crucial point that I want you to understand clearly, because it forms the foundation of everything else I will share with you. The reason so many sincere believers struggle with money is not because they lack faith, or because God is testing their devotion through financial hardship, but because they have never learned to think clearly and systematically about wealth creation and financial stewardship. They approach money with a mixture of superstition, guilt, and wishful thinking, rather than with the same careful reasoning and biblical wisdom they might apply to other areas of life. They pray for provision, while rejecting the education that would enable them to provide for themselves and others more effectively. They ask God to bless their finances, while simultaneously neglecting the practical disciplines that wise financial management requires. I have discovered that there are specific patterns of thinking and behavior that consistently lead to financial struggle and self-consciousness about money, just as there are specific patterns that consistently lead to financial freedom and confidence. These patterns are not mysterious or hidden, but can be studied, understood, and deliberately cultivated by anyone willing to approach the subject with an open mind and a commitment to growth. The challenge is not intellectual but emotional and spiritual, for it requires us to let go of comfortable myths and face uncomfortable truths about our own attitudes and behaviors around money. Consider, for example, the common belief that thinking about money too much is somehow spiritually dangerous, that there is virtue in remaining ignorant of financial principles, because such ignorance supposedly demonstrates trust in divine providence. This belief seems spiritual on the surface, but when examined more carefully, it reveals itself to be a form of spiritual laziness disguised as virtue. God has given us minds capable of understanding complex principles and solving difficult problems, and He clearly expects us to use these gifts in service of His purposes. To refuse to learn about money and finances is like refusing to learn to read, because literacy might distract us from spiritual pursuits, or refusing to learn medicine, because healing should be left entirely to prayer and divine intervention. The truth is that God works through natural means as often as He works through supernatural ones, and He has established certain principles that govern how wealth is created, preserved, and multiplied. These principles are not arbitrary human inventions, but reflect the underlying order and design of creation itself. When we learn to work in harmony with these principles rather than against them, we position ourselves to receive the financial blessings that God desires to give us, not for our own selfish consumption, but so that we might be more effective in carrying out His purposes in the world. I want to pause here and acknowledge that some of you may be feeling uncomfortable with this line of reasoning, perhaps thinking that it sounds too much like prosperity theology, or that it somehow diminishes the importance of spiritual disciplines in favor of worldly wisdom. Let me assure you that this is not my intention, nor is it the logical conclusion of what I am saying. I am not suggesting that financial success is a guarantee of spiritual maturity, nor that poverty is always a sign of spiritual failure. What I am suggesting is that the false separation between spiritual and material concerns has created unnecessary suffering and limited effectiveness in the lives of many sincere believers who could serve God much more powerfully if they were free from financial stress and self-consciousness. The integration of spiritual wisdom and practical financial knowledge is not only possible, but necessary for anyone who wants to be a truly effective steward of God's resources. Just as a musician must understand both the spiritual dimension of music and the technical aspects of their instrument, or a doctor must combine compassionate care with medical expertise, so a faithful steward must combine spiritual maturity with financial literacy. This is not about becoming worldly or materialistic, but about becoming complete and effective in our service to God and others. Now let me share with you some specific observations about the nature of self-consciousness around money, and how it can be overcome through the application of both spiritual principles and practical wisdom. The first thing to understand is that self-consciousness about money usually stems from one of two sources. Either we feel guilty about wanting more than we currently have, or we feel ashamed about our current financial situation and our perceived inability to improve it. Both of these responses are based on false beliefs that can be corrected through careful thinking and spiritual renewal. The guilt about wanting financial improvement often comes from a misunderstanding of biblical teaching about contentment and the dangers of materialism. We have been taught correctly that the love of money is the root of all evil, and that we should be content with what we have. But we have incorrectly concluded from this that any desire for financial improvement is somehow sinful or spiritually immature. This is like concluding that because gluttony is wrong, all desire for food is sinful, or that because pride is dangerous, all desire for achievement is prideful. The problem is not with the desire itself, but with the motivation behind it, and the methods used to fulfill it. There is nothing wrong with wanting to provide better for your family, to have resources available for unexpected emergencies, to be able to give more generously to worthy causes, or to achieve financial independence so that you can pursue your calling without being limited by financial constraints. These are legitimate and even admirable goals, provided they are pursued through honest means and with proper perspective on their ultimate purpose. The key is to want financial improvement for the right reasons and in the right way, not to eliminate the desire altogether. The shame about current financial struggles often comes from comparing our situation to others, or from believing that financial difficulty is always a sign of personal failure or lack of faith. While it is true that some financial problems result from poor decisions or lack of discipline, it is equally true that many people struggle financially through no fault of their own, due to circumstances beyond their control, lack of education or opportunity, or simply because they have never been taught the principles that lead to financial success. There is no shame in acknowledging that you need to learn and grow in this area, any more than there would be shame in acknowledging that you need to learn any other skill or area of knowledge. The path forward begins with developing what I call financial courage, the willingness to face honestly where you are, where you want to be, and what it will take to bridge the gap between the two. This requires setting aside both false guilt about legitimate desires and false shame about current limitations, and approaching the subject of money with the same intellectual honesty and spiritual integrity that you would bring to any other important area of life. You must be willing to educate yourself, to ask questions, to seek wise counsel, and to take deliberate action based on sound principles rather than on emotion or cultural conditioning. I have found that one of the most liberating realizations for those who struggle with self-consciousness about money is the understanding that wealth building is fundamentally about creating value for others rather than about taking value away from them. In a free market economy, money flows toward those who provide goods and services that others find valuable, which means that the most effective way to increase your own wealth is to become more skilled at serving others in ways they appreciate enough to pay for. This transforms the entire conversation about money from a zero-sum game, where one person's gain must come at another's expense, to a positive-sum game, where everyone can benefit through voluntary exchange. When you understand that earning money is essentially about solving problems and meeting needs for other people, the self-consciousness and guilt begin to dissolve, replaced by a sense of purpose and excitement about finding better ways to serve. This shift in perspective is crucial, because it aligns financial goals with spiritual values rather than setting them in opposition to each other. Instead of feeling that you must choose between serving God and making money, you begin to see that serving others effectively through your work and business activities is itself a form of serving God, and that the money you earn is both a reward for value created and a resource for creating even more value in the future. This understanding also helps address the common fear that focusing on financial improvement will somehow make you greedy or materialistic. When your motivation is to serve others more effectively, and your method is to create genuine value through honest work, the natural result is not greed but generosity, not materialism but wise stewardship. You begin to see money not as something to hoard for its own sake, but as a tool for accomplishing worthy purposes, including providing for your family, supporting causes you believe in, and creating opportunities to help others improve their own circumstances. The practical application of these principles begins with developing what I call financial literacy, a clear understanding of how money works, how wealth is created, and how financial decisions compound over time to create either prosperity or poverty. This is not complicated or mysterious knowledge, but simply requires the same kind of focused study and application that you would invest in learning any other important skill. Just as you would not expect to become a skilled musician without studying music theory and practicing regularly, or to become a good writer without studying language and practicing composition, you cannot expect to become financially successful without studying financial principles and practicing sound money management. The beauty of this approach is that it removes both the mystique and the anxiety around financial success by making it a matter of education and application rather than luck or special talent. While it is true that some people have natural aptitudes that make financial success easier for them, just as some people have natural musical or athletic ability, it is also true that anyone of reasonable intelligence and character can learn to manage money effectively and build wealth over time, if they are willing to invest the necessary effort in education and discipline. The first practical step is to develop a clear understanding of your current financial situation, including your income, expenses, assets, and debts. This requires honest assessment and careful record keeping, which many people avoid because they're afraid of what they might discover. But just as a doctor cannot prescribe effective treatment without first diagnosing the problem accurately, you cannot develop an effective financial strategy without first understanding clearly where you stand. This process of assessment is not about judgment or shame, but about gathering the information necessary for making wise decisions going forward. Once you have a clear picture of your current situation, the next step is to educate yourself about the fundamental principles that govern money and wealth building. This includes understanding concepts like compound interest, inflation, risk management, and diversification, as well as practical skills like budgeting, investing, and debt management. There are excellent books, courses, and other resources available on these topics, and the investment of time and money in financial education will pay dividends far beyond any other form of education you might pursue. But education alone is not sufficient. It must be combined with disciplined action and consistent application over time. The principles of wealth building are not complicated, but they do require patience and persistence to implement effectively. This is where many people stumble, because they want immediate results and become discouraged when the progress seems slow. But just as physical fitness cannot be achieved through sporadic bursts of activity, but requires consistent exercise over time, financial fitness cannot be achieved through occasional spurts of good intentions, but requires consistent application of sound principles day after day, month after month, and year after year. The spiritual dimension of this process is equally important as the practical dimension, because lasting financial success requires not just knowledge and discipline but also wisdom, integrity, and proper motivation. This is where your faith becomes not an obstacle to financial success, but rather the foundation that ensures your success will be both sustainable and meaningful. When your financial goals are aligned with your spiritual values, when your methods are honest and honorable, and when your motivation includes service to others as well as provision for yourself and your family, you create a foundation for prosperity that can weather any storm. I want to emphasize that the journey from financial self-consciousness to financial confidence is not about becoming a different kind of person, but about becoming more fully yourself, the person God created you to be. When you are no longer hindered by shame, guilt, or ignorance around money, when you have developed the knowledge and skills necessary for effective financial stewardship, you are free to focus on your true calling and purpose without the distraction and limitation that financial stress creates. This freedom is not an end in itself but a means to greater service and more effective living. The transformation I am describing is possible for anyone willing to approach it with the same combination of faith and reason, spiritual commitment and practical wisdom that should characterize all areas of Christian living. It requires letting go of false beliefs and cultural conditioning that have kept you trapped in financial mediocrity, while embracing the adventure of learning and growing in an area that God clearly expects His people to handle with intelligence and skill. I want to share with you a profound realization that came to me during my own journey of understanding the relationship between faith and material prosperity. There is a remarkable parallel between the way God transforms our spiritual nature and the way He transforms our financial circumstances, and understanding this parallel can accelerate both forms of growth in ways that will surprise and delight you. Just as spiritual maturity does not happen through a single moment of conversion, but through the daily practice of spiritual disciplines, prayer, study, and obedience, financial maturity does not happen through a single windfall or lucky break, but through the daily practice of wise decision-making, disciplined saving, strategic investing, and generous giving. The enemy of our souls understands this parallel perfectly, which is why he works so diligently to convince us that spiritual and material growth are somehow incompatible, that we must choose between earthly wisdom and heavenly treasure. But this is one of his most effective lies, because the same character qualities that lead to spiritual maturity, patience, diligence, wisdom, integrity, and long-term thinking, are precisely the qualities that lead to financial success when applied consistently over time. When we develop these qualities in one area of our lives, they naturally overflow into other areas, creating a synergistic effect that multiplies our effectiveness in all dimensions of living. Consider how the discipline of regular prayer develops our capacity for consistency and commitment, qualities that are essential for successful investing and wealth building. Think about how studying scripture develops our ability to think clearly and discern truth from falsehood, abilities that are crucial for making wise financial decisions and avoiding the countless scams and get-rich-quick schemes that prey upon the financially naive. Reflect on how genuine worship cultivates gratitude and contentment, attitudes that protect us from the materialism and greed that can corrupt even legitimate financial success. These connections are not accidental but reflect the integrated nature of human character and the consistency of divine design throughout all areas of life. This understanding should fill you with hope rather than anxiety, because it means that as you grow spiritually, you are also developing the foundation for financial success. And as you apply yourself to learning financial wisdom, you are also exercising spiritual muscles that will serve you well in every area of life. The journey toward financial freedom becomes not a distraction from spiritual growth but another avenue for spiritual development, another opportunity to practice the virtues that God desires to see developed in all His children. As I conclude, I want to invite you to consider that your current financial situation, whatever it may be, is not a permanent state but simply a starting point for growth and improvement. The self-consciousness and shame you may have felt about money can be replaced with confidence and competence as you apply yourself to learning the principles that govern financial success. The anxiety and frustration of financial struggle can give way to the peace and freedom that come from wise stewardship and sound planning. I encourage you to take the first step on this journey by committing to your own financial education and by beginning to apply what you learn with discipline and consistency. Seek out resources that combine spiritual wisdom with practical knowledge. Surround yourself with people who can support and encourage your growth. And remember that God desires your success in every area of life, including your finances, not for selfish purposes but so that you might be more effective in serving His purposes in the world. If this message has resonated with you, I invite you to join our community of learners and seekers who are committed to integrating spiritual truth with practical wisdom in every area of life. Subscribe to this channel for more insights on how faith and reason can work together to create the life of purpose, prosperity, and peace that God intends for His children. Your journey toward financial freedom and spiritual maturity can begin today, and I would be honored to be part of that journey with you as we discover together the magnificent adventure of living as God intended us to live.